afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here on such a beautiful afternoon. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Danny Dorling today for what will be the final day of the Oxford Literary Festival. So Danny's going to be here today to talk about his most recent publication, 7 Children, Inequality and Britain's Next Generation. Danny has been a professor in the School of Geography and the Environment here in the University of Oxford since 2013, and he is attached to St Peter's College. His work focuses on issues of housing, health, employment, education, wealth and poverty, to list a few, and he has co-authored and sole-authored too many books for me to list here, but just to highlight a few. Shattered Nation, Inequality and the Geography of a Failing State in 2023, and Peak Injustice, Solving Britain's Inequality Crisis in 2024. Much of his work is available on open access, and he has a fantastic website, which I urge you all to look at if you haven't already. And his latest book, The Next Crisis, What We Think About the Future, is due to be released next year. So there will be questions at the end, but I ask that you kindly wait for either myself or one of the other stewards to bring you the microphone so that everybody can hear. And also just to remind you that there will be book signing just outside at the desk in the entrance. So without further ado, thank you for being here, and please join me in welcoming Danny. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much for that. Thank you all for coming. Apologies if I sound slightly weird. I sound slightly weird to myself. I was in Finland on Friday, and I had to have a tooth just here taken out. What I can tell you is that Finnish dentists are brilliant on a sample of 1, and I'm all okay, but I'm stoked up with antibiotics at the moment. 7 Children is what it says on the tin. It's a book about 7 children. What I'm going to do first is show you a few pictures about the kind of work I do, which hopefully explains why I've tried to write this book. I'm a human geographer. I went to university in 1986 to study maths and statistics and computing and a bit of geography. I'm interested in using numbers to describe society. I look at things like world distributions. This is a map of the world's children about 15 years ago. We have, even then, about only 0.5% of the children in the world are in the UK, and that's dropping. The kind of thing I normally do is non-fiction. It's books about facts, whereas 7 Children is a mixture of fiction and non-fiction, so it's a different kind of book. A couple of years ago, I did Slow Down, which was all about how most things in the world are slowing down. They're not accelerating, even if they tell you that they are. The kind of things that are accelerating are things like carbon emissions, which is what that little red dot is in front of you. I'm interested in different ways of looking at data. So here's the carbon emissions shown differently, exactly the same data, but now you see the amount of emissions going up on the vertical scale, and on the horizontal scale you see the change in each year. You can see how during recessions the increase is less. Every time we have a global summit about carbon, we think we've done something, and then the emissions increase. I'm very interested in population. This is the same kind of graph, but showing you global population change. We're currently around about 8 billion people. We'll probably make it to about 10. This graph has us going up to about 11 billion people, but the data's 4, 5, 6 years old. The United Nations keeps on updating its projections and saying actually it's getting less and less and less. So we have fewer and fewer children in the world, everywhere, almost without exception. We have fewer and fewer children in Britain. We have fewer children in Oxford. It's like there's been a Pied Piper in this city. If you look at the census data over time, you'll see that the number of children in Oxford's been going down and down, even as the population of the city has risen. And that's not just the universities or the effects of the universities, because the elderly population of Oxford has increased. It's because it's unaffordable to be here if you're going to have a family. I'll show you this graph in a different form, just because I like showing graphs. And it makes me more confident, because you look at this and you don't look at me. Right. I like trying to summarize big things in a very small number of numbers. This is global population, just switched it to a log scale. Always goes up. Even when there's a Black Death, it went up. Even when we went off to the Americas and 60 million people died because we took our diseases to them, it still went up overall because it was rising more in other places. 3 slowdowns. There's the first after 1492 when we go to the Americas and kill lots of people will die. 1820, this is us, the British, and invading 90% of the world's current members of the UN. And this last one is brilliant because it is not coerced, it's not disease, it's not imperialism, it's not colonies. This last one is women having power over their bodies and being able to say that they don't want to have more children, and of course having access to contraception and abortion. And the last one is fascinating because currently by the year 2084, almost certainly earlier, for the first time in the history of our species will stop growing. Children alive today will be members of the largest collection of humans ever on the planet, and the lucky ones who live to old age, very old age, will actually watch the population of humans probably fall. So it's a really interesting time to be looking at this kind of thing. Now, if I look at you, I don't think we've got any children in the room. May have. I won't try and guess. But an audience like this is kind of like the future demography of the world. We're getting older. I tend to write moany books. I don't want to write moany books. A friend of mine called them bitter. I've been looking at inequality for 30 years. And in a way, I've been lucky in that I happen to have started doing this in the country which has had the largest rise in inequality of any country in Europe, possibly any in the world, actually. And is now the most unequal country on this continent, give or take Bulgaria. The unlucky side of this is I happen to live in this country, and they've taken away my right to move to another country in Europe. So I'm going to have to see out my days in Britain. Shattered Nation is about the story of what's happened recently. It came out in, I think, 2023. That graph there is the income inequality trend in the country. The top line is the incomes of the 1% of the 1%, the richest 1 in 10,000 people, who were unbelievably rich, taking about 400 times average income a century ago. A century ago is when Sebastian turned up down there at Hertford with his scout. It's only a century ago that the undergraduates turned up with their servants. Things fell and fell and fell. It's a log scale because inequalities were so incredibly high you can't show them on a normal graph. To the wonderful utopian days of the early 1970s, which was my childhood in Oxford, things had never been as equal. We just got rid of the 11 plus. Nobody knew what a good or bad school was. The university was scared, small, frightened, unimportant. The car factory was big, interesting, the major employer. Core market was ours. Most of the streets of Oxford were ours. And then inequality rose. This is a graph for the whole of the UK, but think about the city of Oxford. And those families who weren't a decent wage because they worked in the car factory, mine was the last year of the men who were employed as apprenticeships in that factory. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer since 2008, and inequality rose again. But we're back to levels of the 1930s. And we may be at a peak again. And we may be at a lower peak than the last peak we got to. This is a weird, strange country, right? Which again is great if you're a human geographer, but not great if you live in it. This is the red line is the UK. That's our public spending as a proportion of GDP. Right? If anybody tells you that Rachel Reeves has done a really good job because you can't possibly do any more outside some fictional boundary, right? Look at all those other countries in Europe that tax and spend more. Now, I sometimes try and give a cynical lecture where I tell people how utterly terrible life is in Belgium and France and Finland and Norway and Denmark and Austria. You can't believe how the world ends if you actually make people like me pay more taxes and you don't let people become as wealthy. You know, there's no civilization over there. This is a wonderful, wonderful place to be. I could take you back to the fact that on Friday morning I needed a dentist to take out a tooth. And I was in the far north of Finland. And we could find one who could do it at 5 o'clock, who charged less than the National Health Service would charge me to do the same thing. Unbelievable. And who treated their job as a job that they should care about, because in a country like Finland, people care about each other. Because the rich are not allowed to be that rich and the poor are not allowed to be that poor. And if somebody tries to make themselves rich, say using the pain of people because their teeth hurts, they're seen as a pariah. These things are entirely possible. They exist in this continent. I'm not talking to you about a utopia about how we could be. This is how we were in the 1970s. It's how other countries are now. We bob along the bottom. The two spikes of the banking crisis of 2008 and COVID. Right? We could fund the NHS to a level which it worked. We could fund our secondary schools at the level we funded them 10 years ago. It's about 25% more. We'd have nobody homeless on our streets. Finland doesn't. We could do all these things, but we choose not to because we've chosen inequality. Right? And in particular, we have chosen inequality. I'm not going to stereotype you too much, but you're at the Oxford Literary Festival. It's the first time they've invited me in 12 years. I'm very grateful to be invited. But we have the power. We are the 10%. We are the people who get to choose, whose opinions are the grown-up opinions, the grown-ups in the rooms. Okay. Times are changing. My job has become dramatically easier in recent years. I can now simply quote John Byrne Murdoch or Stephanie Flanders telling you statistics about how the poorest 20% of the people in this country, in the UK, are on average poorer than the poorest 20% of people in most of Eastern Europe. We are a peripheral country. We are a poor country now, but an incredibly divided country. And because we are so divided, our ability to understand ourselves is really, really diminished. I was very lucky. I was a very naive 16, 17-year-old growing up in this city. I was lucky in that I grew up on a roundabout, which I've ridden about far too many times. It's a Green Road roundabout, in case you wondered, which still has every quarter of the index of deprivation around it. So I was lucky to grow up in a part of this city which had people from different backgrounds quite close to each other, but at a time of great equality. I was lucky to go to a normal school, which was Cheney, which we were just talking about earlier. But I was particularly lucky that I decided to go to the University of Newcastle, and of course that I had the chance to go. Back then, only about 2% of people from normal schools went to university, 1 in 50 others. And that wasn't because I was brilliant. My dad was a doctor. So I've outed myself immediately. right? I was always going to go to university. I was lucky in that I chose to go to Newcastle upon Tyne in 1986, and that was an education. Because in 1986, the majority of families in Newcastle upon Tyne had no work. So I actually got to see the 1980s. At the same time as me, I'm age 57, a set of young men, my age or a year or two older, came to this city and wore sub-fusk and got drunk and did parties, and then went off to London to jobs that were set up for them, and then to the Conservative central office, and later becomes ministers and prime ministers, and never had a clue. Right? I'm not bitter about them. They never had a chance to learn about the society they lived in. I was lucky. I was lucky that I grew up where I grew up in Oxford, and I was lucky to spend 10 years living in the north of England and seeing what the Conservatives had done to the north and how people are treated in different ways. Now, much more unequal, much harder, much more obvious. We have lowest benefits as compared to average incomes in the continent. A friend of mine has printed the instructions if you want to claim universal credit onto sheets of silk. There's an art exhibit. I got this cartoon recently, I quite liked it, which shows you my politics. It's not a good situation. You probably don't feel that it's a good situation in general. We are currently, what is it this week we're doing? Working out, are we actually going to have that Love Actually moment where our dashing Hugh Grant style Prime Minister tells the American president where to get off or not? Not yet, I think. 7 children. So we're finally on to the book that you've come to hear about. I wrote 7 children because I wanted to try to write a book that was readable. The problem with writing non-fiction is it appeals to certain people who like graphs and facts and paragraphs, but lots of people do not like non-fiction books. So 7 children reads as a fiction book. At least the first 200 odd pages do. The last 100 pages are the notes, because everything in the fiction part of the book is backed up with data. I was turned down by more than 30 publishers for this book, which might put you off buying it later. And the publisher Hearst, who took it, did re-engineer it quite a lot. But I was turned down, I think, mainly because there's no such thing as a fiction stroke non-fiction editor. There's no such thing as a fiction non-fiction list. You can't actually get a book published where you don't say it's one or the other. It's very, very hard to do. I did this once before with a little book called The Central Line, called The 32 Stops About the Central Line, where I made up 32 fictional families, each living at one tube stop on the tube line, and just wrote 3 pages about each of them. That was quite hard. This was much, much harder. So if I could tell you anything of use, it's to say, if you're somebody who does non-fiction, making up characters is incredibly difficult. The main problem is this. For what I normally do, it's easy. Every sentence simply has to be true. Every paragraph has to be true. Every fact has to be true. And then I have to decide which facts and put them into an order and try to make it interesting. But if you make up 7 children, you have to decide what their parents do, how many siblings they have, what they're called, and you can't change that later. Now, in the real world, you can just check what is true. But in your fictional creative world, it is much harder to do. And there's also a worry about the words you put into people's mouths. How much are you talking about yourself when you're trying to be somebody else? It's quite a disconcerting thing to try to do. Has anybody noticed the error on the cover yet? There's 8 bars, yeah. My lovely publisher, I think they were all English graduates. Sorry. When I pointed out when they showed me the cover, which I do like, I said, "Can you make one change?" They went, "No, it's really balanced. It looks lovely." Which kind of is a difference between art and science. I like, as I'll show you in a minute, this last bar is me and Boris Johnson. Me and Boris Johnson have far more in common than the other bars because we're up there. I am in the top 2 or 3% of household income in the country. I actually grew up in the 1%, just almost the same as Rishi Sunak. Father, GP. The problem is my mum didn't run the pharmacy next door. Otherwise, I could have gone to Winchester or wherever he went. But I'm in the 2 or 3%. I'm not giving anything away. That's the entire professorial salary range, right? But incredibly well off. I'm incredibly well off. I'm lucky because of what I studied that I know I'm incredibly well off. Most academics in this university are not aware of how incredibly well off they are. They probably get extremely annoyed when I say this. Endless conversations over we need to pay more to get the best talent in the world and so on. That isn't our problem. Our problem is the country we've created. And when I say we, of course, this place is more responsible than any other. You know, we literally train the politicians who mucked it up. You know, I've just been in Exeter College, lovely place. I was in the garden for the first time. No, but they are responsible for Dominic Cummings. I think one day there'll be reparations. Anyway, sorry. Just blame it on the antibiotics. Right. And it doesn't help, I think, to get depressed about this. I don't think it helps to get depressed. I think it just helps to be clear-sighted and realistic about what it means to live in the most unequal country, give or take Bulgaria, at the most unequal time since the 1930s. What does income inequality actually mean? The grey bars, which you may be able to see, are single percentiles of income. So our Boris, when he's not Prime Minister, remember when he was Prime Minister he couldn't afford wallpaper. When he's not Prime Minister, he's on 4 or 5 times more, is up there in the one. That goes way up to about an average of 600,000 a year. 2%, 3%, that's me, 4%, 5%. Our richest child is that purple line. What I did is take the income distribution of Britain of families with children from the households below average income data set, divided it in terms of the children into 7 groups. There are 14 million children around about 2018 when I began doing this. So each group has 2 million, 2 million, 2 million, 2 million, 2 million, 2 million. Now I took the middle child out, there's 2 million. So we're going to forget the poorest million children in Britain. Those are the children whose parents go to food banks. They're the children who are sofa surfing. They're the children who've got parents in prison. We're going to forget about those for the moment. And we're also going to forget the richest 1 million children, which are children like my children and children like the child I was. And we're going to talk about 7 typical children, the middle child of each 2 million group. So it's not about the extremes, but still the inequalities are enormous. The amount of money being shown here is how much disposable income these families have. That is how much money they have to spend after housing, so after they've paid for their housing, and after they pay their taxes, and after they've got benefits. And it's the money that they need to buy food, soap, clothes, bus tickets, toys, everything else. everything other than the rent and the mortgage. Our poorest child is called Anna. She's going to be called a Joa, but I can't pronounce it properly, and the publisher was worried about calling her a Joa, so she's Anna. Her mum is a care worker, senior care worker, in a care home for old people. If we are lucky, she'll be the one looking after us, if we get to live that long. That's Anna's mother. And the amount of money that they have is about £118 a week to live off. And £118 is an interesting sum, because if you take it back 100 years, it's about £1 100 years ago, and 100 years ago, give or take an extra 12 years, somebody wrote a book called Around About £1 a Week, which was about poverty. So for our poorest child of 7 typical children, missing out the poorest million, nothing has materially changed in a century. If you like, yes, the mother's got to sell a phone, because you have to have a phone. But in real terms, the poorest is that thin little slice of bread. And she's working. She's a part-time senior assistant in an old age people's home. Second child is called Brandon. Brandon's mum and dad don't work. Anna's dad, by the way, isn't living with them. That's part of the reason why she's so poor. Brandon's mum and dad don't work. Brandon's mum probably can't work. Brandon's dad is an expert at filling in the universal credit forms. Just about manages to do it. It's not easy to do. And they've got more money than Anna's. We go round and round. I won't go through them all, but you may be wondering about child number 7. Child number 7 is Gemma. I don't want to give too much away, but we'll. And Gemma's mum and dad run a corner shop. They run the corner shop quite well, quite efficient. Their incomes are each, after paying tax, they don't get any benefits, after paying a small mortgage they've got on a flat above the shop, they're both on £25,000 a year. So that's £50,000 a year total, disposable income, after paying the mortgage. So if you're in a family where after paying for your housing, you have an income of over 50,000, you're doing better than Gemma, our rich kid. I would love to survey the Oxford. We won't do a survey, don't worry. I sometimes scare audiences by saying, we'll just quietly just tell your next door neighbour what your income is. And, you know, and if yours is higher than theirs, could you swap seats? And we do it. We don't have to do it 8 times. And anyway, I won't do that. One day, I might be brave. Hay Festival, I think. Pie chart. So the worst thing about the pie chart isn't the inequality that you can see. It's that you could take half of that circle, and that half is going to families like mine, the richest, the parents of the richest million children. We're taking half of that entire circle. And we think we need it. We think we need it because we think we might have to pay for a private dentist, right? We think we need it because, you know, really need a holiday in Finland. We think we need it because it'd be quite nice to have 2 cars. It'd be quite nice to pay for the kids to go to Magdalen. Yeah? It'd be quite nice to pay for them to do a master's degree. Wouldn't it be quite nice to have a second home in France? One that we could at least go to for 90 days out of 180 a year. And why do we think, why do people who are really well off think all these things? Because we live in such an unequal society that it is harder to get by if you are rich. Right? That's the order. Let's show you a few more of these. These graphs are in the book. You see, I'm deliberately not reading you out part of the book or showing you my brilliant attempts at writing the thoughts of parents and children. You have to get the book if you want to see that. this is more about just what is exceptional. This is part of a much larger graph of all the crises there's ever been in wages in this country. The time series in the Bank of England goes back to the 1700s. I'm only showing you last 130 years here. But the one we're currently in is the one that began in 2008 and we almost got out of before the cost of living crisis began. Real wages are down here compared to 2008. The one we're currently in is set possibly to beat the worst on record, which is 1798 to 1822. Right? So these, apart from forgetting that we actually live here now in this situation, we are living in the biggest cost of living crisis since records began, of the longest time series of records kept by any country in the world. The second graph is our inequality measure, which, if you could see, in 1960s, 1970s is very low. Thank you, Margaret Thatcher and Somerville. I think she was Somerville, was she? Yeah. But also, John Major was good. Actually was. Inequality fell slightly under John Major. Tony Blair, St John's. A couple of years of Gordon Brown from that other country, which is now entirely separate. In case you haven't noticed, no child from Scotland now comes down to university in England. Right, they've left, culturally. Haven't got round to the independence referendum yet, the second one, but they've left. And then, where is it? Brasenose, who's our Prime Minister from there. Merton, Lincoln, anyway, not testing you. Income inequality rose massively in the 1980s and then stayed really, really high. New Labour didn't dent it one iota. Not one iota. Gordon Brown moved 1 million children from just below a poverty line to just above a poverty line by such a little amount that it didn't alter our inequality statistics. Could have been worse. Could have got even higher. We could have got to the position in the United States. New Labour did very well for funding the NHS, did very well for changing windows to double glazing in council houses, did very well, I think, for doing devolution, but didn't touch inequality. This is United Nations data from 2012 to just before the pandemic. It's all the countries of the world that the UN has comparable data for, and changes in child poverty rates. And it's wonderful news. And it's in the book. So Poland, look at this enormous 30% drop in 7 years in child poverty. Slovenia, Latvia, Lithuania, Korea. Right, think about the film Parasite. Think about Squid Games. Think about what's just happened in Korea. Yeah? Where the judge has actually said that what he did was illegal. Estonia, Canada, Romania, Portugal, Croatia, Japan, Ireland, Malta, Greece, Belgium, Czechia, New Zealand, Bulgaria. Right? We're going to get there. We're going to get to number one. Yeah. Bulgaria, by the way, also had 3 prime ministers in as short a time as we did, but they had elections anyway. Chile, even the United States. And this is wonderful news. Right? I don't want to depress you. There are amazing things going on in the world. Child poverty is falling fast in most places. And then you go up and up, and you might look at the yellow ones and go, oh, they've risen 10%. That's Norway, Switzerland, France, and Iceland. But they have some of the lowest rates in the world. So 10% rise is actually a small number of children. And then, of course, there's us. Biggest increase in child poverty of all the countries United Nations measures in its most recent period, and we're already one of the worst, right? It is hard to know why we're bottom of the class, but somebody has to be, and we are. In a way, the current government makes it easier to explain. They came into office committed to getting rid of the 2-child limit on benefits and then didn't do it. If you're trying to understand, how can we be so bad? Well, they're trying to make it obvious and showing you. This data is more controversial, but it's the only published data of the heights of our children going down in the United Kingdom. They've also gone down in the United States. They rise in France. Germany, there's a small dip. You remember that wonderful moment when Angela Merkel, when the 14, 15-year-old girl cried? Remember that? And she decided to let in 1.5 million Syrians, half of whom were children. If you let in lots of war refugees, your height of children will drop slightly because you include them, but not much. Our heights of children just drop. I've got stuff on politics, but I'm running out of time because I really want you to ask questions. So I won't say much about this other than this is age. Each square is 1 million people. If you remember, I try and simplify things, right, without getting rid of what's useful. But if you want to understand the election, this was 2019. I'm pretty sure. I don't know why I've got him down there. Labour vote spread across the age range, higher amongst younger people. You don't get up to 1 million Tory voters until you get to 43. There's your block of Tory voters. That's Labour. Let's go forward. Here's last year's general election. Labour vote actually lower amongst the young. You know, remember it fell. So it really spread out. Tory vote, smaller, still old. That's Reform, slightly worrying. This is not voting, in the middle. Right. I'll move forward from that because it's complicated. We're almost getting to the end. Well, we're a weird country with a weird voting system. It's not democratic. We share it with Iran. You know, we actually have clerics in our legislature. House of Lords is a lovely place for people's old age. I visited recently. I was amazed at the number of Zimmer frames coming in. I'm joking, you know, but I live here. I've always lived here. But it's pitiful, our so-called democracy. It's pitiful what we've achieved. These lines are sloping down. Right? These are European countries. This is the income inequality rates. Norway, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Ireland, Netherlands, France, Greece, Portugal, Romania, Spain, Italy, UK, Bulgaria. Bulgaria out of date. So it does bug me, Bulgaria. Inequality is falling worldwide. Apart from a few billionaires, where the number of billionaires we're really concerned about actually is falling. The Sunday Times rich list used to be of 1,000 families. It's now only of 250 families because the other 750 aren't doing so well. Compared to real incomes, house prices haven't risen for several years. That's a reduction in wealth. Income inequality in this country probably peaked in 2018, as far as we can tell. Every trade union agreement since 2019 has been progressive. So the lower you are paid, the biggest absolute, or at least relative, increase you get in your pay. Since 2008, senior civil servants have seen a real pay cut of 25%. Junior civil servants, a real pay cut of 12%. Everybody's poorer, but the gap is narrowing. This happened before. This happened throughout the 1920s and 1930s. It's begun again. Doesn't mean it will continue, but once it begins, once you begin to say it's not acceptable that people at the top are taking quite so much when you have these problems, it tends to carry on. You can tell I'm an academic because I really worried about whether it's nice to use the word parasites with billionaires, but I think they'll be okay. I don't think they'll be hurt, but you know, we worry about people's feelings. We are obsessed. So it's what we do in the modern day university. You know, don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, even the billionaires. My last slide, and we've got hopefully 20 minutes for questions because I'm much more interested in your questions. The book tells the story of 7 children. It takes them from their birth in 2018, in the autumn of 2018, around about the time that they go to school. I use the spoken word of their parents to explain the situation they're in. I have tried my hardest to make them as representative as possible. They are Anna, Brandon, Candice, David, Emily, Freddie, and Gemma. I got a shock of my life about 2 weeks ago when I was invited to give a talk somewhere, and the person who invited me to give the talk asked how I'd managed to write the third child based on what had happened to him. The third child's parents received an eviction letter from their landlord. He'd received one at about the same time. He worked. He had a good job. His wife worked. They couldn't pay the rent. For 11 months, they'd been in a B&B. The only reason they'd been in a B&B, that they could be in a B&B, is they had a 15-year-old daughter. Otherwise, they wouldn't have received any help at all, and they still had to fight for that. And so 3 of them were in a room for 11 months, a single room, before finally being rehoused somewhere. And that's the third child. I can tell you lots of terrible stories. I could tell you stories about this city, about the fact that one of the interesting things about Oxford is that if you look at the wards of Oxford, a tenth of the wards are in each decile group by the index of deprivation. So you may think that Oxford's a rich, gentrified city, and in some ways it is, but the cost of housing is so high in this city that of the poorest 10% of people in all of England, we have a representative number of them inside the city of Oxford. And of the richest 10%, we also have a representative size. You might think, well, surely we're richer than that. You don't know how rich London is. And, and Parktown and Summertown are not that big. And lots of houses there are empty. So in terms of population, it's not quite as high as you think. My last slide is just telling you the kind of things I think we need to do. We've been talking about this for a very long time. These are the 10 commandments of the socialist Sunday school movement, right, over 100 years ago. Stop being so greedy. Share. Doesn't make your country richer. Doesn't make your children happier. Doesn't work for the children of the rich. You just get paranoia about the rich. That's why 1 in 3 children at age 15 are going to private schools in this city. Absolute paranoia and fear. Doesn't happen across the rest of Europe. We have hardly any private schools in the rest of Europe. The rich do not benefit as well from this. They don't get better healthcare. They don't get better health treatment just because 1 in 10 people went private last year. We don't live any longer. We don't suffer less pain. We don't have better quality housing. Right? It's a mug's game. Need to stop doing it. Kind of as simple as that. Right? I may sound arrogant about it, but I think the current government in power and the way that they are so unwilling to act shows the extent of the problem we currently have. And if you think it's not possible to act, the last thing I'll leave you with, so please think of questions, is to think of that brilliant Conservative minister a few summers ago, who at the end of the summer rushed into the lobby in the Houses of Parliament and announced that 200 buildings within schools, 200 rooms, couldn't be used anymore because the concrete was unsafe and it might fall on the children at any time. Now, the fascinating thing about that, and I think I have it in the book, is that she spent the summer arguing with her officials and other ministers who had wanted them to keep the schools open with concrete that could at any time have fallen on the heads of children. Okay? So people can do good things, Conservatives can do good things. How do you sort out a situation in which you have so many buildings which are unsafe? Well, imagine this. Imagine that we had more buildings for children to be educated in than any other country in Europe, more square meters. Imagine if we had more teachers per child. Imagine if we had more teaching assistants. You don't have to imagine it because we do. We have an enormous number of schools and teachers and teaching assistants. It's just that we're so unequal and so frightened of each other that we have an apartheid education system. Right? And so the majority of school buildings in this city and school playing fields are being used by a minority of children. It's just stupid. Right? And it's time to accept it's stupid and to stop doing it. Thank you very much for your attention. Please ask me some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny, for that fascinating talk. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and myself or my colleague will come. So here we go. Here's the first question.
Thank you very much, Danny. What would be the most important policy change to deal with inequality, and what was the worst policy change that caused inequality?
The worst one was bringing down the top rate of income tax. I've forgotten the Chancellor who did it, but the windows opened in the City of London. They cheered at that point. Because once you bring the top rate down, I think it was to around about 40%, and it's done suddenly, you create a huge incentive for people who are already greedy to try and be greedier. And that's what we saw. And it certainly didn't create innovation or, reward talent, or the tall poppies grew ever so taller, right? What that bringing down of the top rate of income tax was a license to be greedy and to try and get more money, because you're going to keep more of it. If you could get paid an extra $1 million a year as a banker, you're going to keep 60% of that, 600 grand. Whereas when you're paying 80% tax, why argue for the extra $1 million? Because you're only going to get 200 grand. So that single policy of reducing top level taxes, and you can see it in the work of Thomas Piketty, where he looks at the different top tax rates and how things went wrong. The most effective policy I've seen in recent years has been the one that's resulted in the single biggest drop in child poverty, I think, in Europe. But we only got the latest data last week, and we never report on this. And the country which has done this in all of Europe, it's a faraway, remote country that you'll never have heard of. It's called Scotland. And during the pandemic, Nicola Sturgeon and her government introduced a £10 a week payment for children aged under 6 whose families were in receipt of universal credit or any other credit. That's now all children under 16, and it's nearer to £30 a week. It means a family of 3 in Scotland, 3 children, get between £4,000 to £5,000 money from the state, so no child in Scotland goes cold or hungry, and it's not tapered. Just did it. And we don't even report it. We don't even report it. And worse than that, Gordon Brown attacked it. But thankfully, the Scottish Labour Party told him to shut up. And the Scottish Labour Party and the Scottish National Party have an agreement not to attack the Scottish child payment. And that's the most affected, certainly in terms of child poverty. But they did it at the expense of other things, particularly the elderly. They decided to look after the children, given what they could do.
Thank you for an excellent talk and an amazing array of data that you have. It's very alarming. I just want to ask about taxation and why both Labour and Conservative governments have made it so utterly totemic that no one will touch taxes in this country properly, and what can we do about that?
Yeah, it really matters. My target would be Germany. So I would say we should aim to be on the level of Germany. This graph, although it's public spending, give or take borrowing is also a graph of taxation, in effect. And if you can see where the level in Germany is, so I've made the black line thicker. It's how you present it. So there was a political party which did present the idea of becoming like Germany, which is not, all those other countries are far more equal than Germany. But it didn't say, let's try and become a bit more like Germany, which is not France. We're English, we're not very good at doing that. But the problem is that the political party didn't say, let's be like Germany. What it did do is present a costed manifesto where the cost of everything it was going to do before it said it would pay off the WASPy women, the cost of everything it was going to do equaled within 100% of the German budget. And that was in 2017 and 2019, and it was Labour Party. But it didn't spell it out really clearly. And we also have this enormous fear amongst the top 10, 5%. So you get people like that man on Newsnight, who I think was earning 85,000 a year, claiming he couldn't possibly be in the top 10% because everybody knew was richer. One thing you have to well, and it is, if you want a disconcerting thing to think about your life, think about your friends and think how many of them are better off than you and how many are worse off than you. And if you are normal, you probably have more friends who are better off than you and fewer who've got less than you. Now, of course, statistically, that can't be true. So what actually happens is that people don't tend to think of their friends who are poorer as friends, right? And that person, this is what we do this, right? And so you never think that you're paid too much or receive too much because compared to the group you compare yourself with, you're getting less than them. And that's the problem. The crueler way I put this is the news conference in the Guardian newspaper and the people there making decisions in 2019. In May in 2019, the Labour Party was 10 points ahead in the polls. The Guardian could have gone with Labour, rather than ending up in a position where it's essentially telling people to vote for Boris Johnson. Why did the Guardian do that? It was not because the Guardian newspaper had some kind of great concern about anti-Semitism. It was because the people at the top of the Guardian newspaper are like me. They're in the top 5 or 2%. And their salaries are like mine or higher. And they need to pay the fees for North London Collegiate Girls' School. And they need to pay for that holiday in Tuscany, where they'll probably be sharing a villa with somebody else. And the pool might not be that big. But if you're not in Tuscany in that week, you're nobody. If you know, because that's when everybody goes on holiday in Tuscany at the same time. And this little house in the Brecon Beacons to look after. And if Labour had been elected in 2019 on that manifesto, their world, my world, would utterly change. And that's why we don't touch income tax seriously. And it's partly because we can't see the benefits, and partly because the benefits will take 10 or 20 years to come. The benefits that my friends in the Nordic countries have, where a university professor is paid so much less, but lives a life where they really are not worrying about crime, where their children walk to the nearest school because all the schools are good and the schools don't cost them a penny to pay for, where they have a health service where the question is it going to be 2 or 3 days or a couple of weeks? Then it's much easier to pay higher taxes. And you also end up in a situation where you simply don't pay people as much because they don't need to be paid as much because your housing system doesn't go out of kilter like ours has done. But it's not being able to explain this. What I think we're going to get is, because of tariffs, and if the Treasury are clever, we will see tax rises and we blame it on Donald. What worries me is that Rachel Reeves, the lass from St John's, what worries me is that I think she may think this is as good as it gets, and she doesn't realise. Nobody's shown her this graph. When she did PPE, I don't think they had this graph, and they didn't show it her. And if you look at the beliefs of the tutors in the past, we have a responsibility in this university for what we have done by putting into the minds of 18, 19 and 20-year-olds of sensible grown-up economics to end up like this, right? And the university has to take some responsibility as well. It's not just their fault. They were children when they came here.
Now you're full of rage about this, very suppressed rage, and I completely understand that. What I want to know is when you share this data with politicians or with, say, people who teach in the university, what sort of reaction do you get? Does anyone else share your rage?
Lots of people are angry, but the people who are most angry are people who it actually affects. So I often get the opposite reaction from different audiences. If I talk to a Labour Party in Gloucester, people can say to me, why don't you appear to care enough? Because I might tell jokes and other things. So it varies depending on the audience. It's quite tricky doing different audiences. I do a lot of school talks. And of course our schools are very different, and it's tricky there. Politicians. you can guess my politics. I am a member of the Labour Party still, amazingly. I don't want to leave. I want them to chuck me out, but I'm very polite. What you've currently got is a set of what I call the grown-ups in the room, which is how they describe themselves. Because I've been in meetings where they've said, "Oh, it's really good we don't have any of those left-wingers here, and we can be the grown-ups in the room." So I get described as a child for not understanding how the world is. The reactions I get are upset and anger, often well hidden. How can you prick at we're such lovely people. We could be Conservatives, but we're not. We're in Labour and we're trying to make things better. Or, so I grew up in this city, and the Labour Party used to meet in Cali Workers Social Club. I come back and it's meeting in a church in Summertown. If you want an idea about how the world's changed. And I went to a Labour Party annual thing down near the River Thames, and the chant was, there was a chant. And the chant was, who are we doing it for? We're doing it for the poor. The Labour Party used to be a party of people who were poor once, or still. So I get a lot of anger. I'll probably upset some people in the room by saying this, because this is well-meaning, liberal, trying to make things better, arguing folk. But the problem is the left has failed in Britain. It's not so much that the Conservatives were a brilliant, most successful party in history. Right? If you compare different European countries, our left was worse than the left in other European countries, which is why we've ended up in this situation. My colleagues vary in university. They're interesting. They're very, very tolerant. I worked for 10 years in Sheffield before I came here. In Sheffield University, I was absolutely middle of the road, a bit boring. Here, I'm a radical left-winger. Right? This is a Conservative university. This is a Conservative university. For all the politeness, for all they were open-minded, this is a Conservative university. Produces Conservatives. Alumni have elected a Conservative Chancellor. It's a safe space for Conservatives. It's the place you come to. Remember the happiest day in David Cameron's life, if you ever read his biography? The happiest day was the day he opened the letter to find he got the place here. Then he corrected himself and said, "Oh, when I got married." So I worry about how I should present this. I am angry about it because it's impossible not to be. I try not to tell the most awful stories, but of course, because we have got into a situation of the poorest getting poorer, then there are shock horror stories that you can tell. But I don't think it helps to do that. It just gives people despair. Whereas telling people there was a time in this city where, because we just got rid of the 11 plus, suddenly Charwell, that really dodgy secondary modern, if you know, Charwell was the bottom school of Oxford. Suddenly Charwell might be all right to go to. And you didn't have to try to get your child into the county grammar, which later became Peers. But they were all on the same. Right? Imagine that, rather than being what is probably the most educationally divided city in Europe. I haven't got the numbers to prove it. I just challenge anybody to come up with a city that's more divided. And that's our state schools. Right? Before we start talking about the private schools, where we have secondary moderns in our private schools where you go to, where you fail the entrance exams to the other ones. So it's unbelievable. Right? This is a city of fewer and fewer children who mix less and less and less. You know, what on earth are we playing at? That's Oxford, but I'm talking Oxford. Hope that,
Rage on.
Well, I'm afraid that I think that's all we have time for today, but if you have questions, Danny will be signing books, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer any of those. So, without further ado, please join me in just thanking Danny for such an interesting and fascinating previous hour, and thank you all for being here as well.